Hey y'all, Cletus here. Today we're diving into something real heavy but important. How slavery began in America and how it shaped our country's history. We're talking about the roots of a system that lasted over 200 years and its echoes that still resonate today. Now it all started on August 20th, 1619, when a ship called the White Lion landed in Jamestown, Virginia, carrying about 20 enslaved Africans. This wasn't the first time Africans were enslaved, but it was the start of what would become a brutal institution in the Americas. These folks were brought here by English privateers who had captured them from a Portuguese slave ship. And who orchestrated all this? Well, it was a mix of European traders, African rulers, and colonial settlers all looking to profit off of human lives. So, who benefited from this? Pretty much anyone with power and money. The colonies needed labor to grow tobacco, sugar, and later cotton, crops that required backbreaking work. The rich plantation owners got richer, while the enslaved were forced to work without pay, rights, or dignity. The economy of the South was built on this system, but it wasn't just a Southern issue. Northern industries also benefited from the trade in cotton and other goods produced by enslaved labor. But what was life like for those enslaved? It was brutal, plain and simple. From sunup to sundown, enslaved people worked the fields, planting, tending, and harvesting crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. They were often given the bare minimum, just enough food to survive, and clothing that barely protected them from the elements. Punishments were harsh and frequent, whether for resisting, trying to escape, or simply for not meeting the impossible demands placed on them. Families were torn apart with husbands, wives, and children sold off to different plantations, never to see each other again. Their lives were controlled in every way, from what they did with their time to who they could marry or even talk to. Despite this, they found ways to resist through songs, stories, and in some cases, outright rebellion. And let's not forget, all of this was happening before the United States was even a country. Slavery was entrenched in the colonies long before 1776, and it played a big role in the expansion efforts. As settlers pushed westward, they took the institution of slavery with them, expanding the practice to new territories. But not everyone was on board with this. Even before independence, there were people in places speaking out against slavery. In the North, some Quakers and other religious groups were among the first to call for abolition. And certain colonies, like Rhode Island, passed early laws to try to limit the importation of enslaved people, though they didn't outright ban the practice. By the time the Declaration of Independence was written, slavery was still legal in all 13 colonies. The Founding Fathers, some of whom were slaveholders themselves, didn't address slavery in the Declaration, even though they were talking about freedom and equality. That contradiction would haunt the country for generations, leading to growing tensions between the North and South as the new nation expanded. Now, there's this idea that the North and South were always at odds over slavery, but it's more complicated than that. In the early days, slavery existed in all the colonies, but over time, the North moved away from it, partially because their economy didn't rely on it as heavily, and partially because of growing abolitionist movements. By the time we get to the 1800s, the divide had deepened. The South was fiercely protective of slavery as the backbone of their economy, while the North was increasingly uncomfortable with it, both morally and economically. But it wasn't just about slavery. The Civil War had a lot of causes, and as a proud Southern man, I've got to acknowledge that there were other issues at play too. States' rights was a big one. Many Southerners felt that the federal government was overstepping its bounds, trying to tell them how to live and what laws to follow. There were also economic differences. The North was industrializing fast, while the South was still mostly agrarian, relying on agriculture and, unfortunately, slavery. But let's be clear, not everyone in the South owned slaves or even supported the practice. Many were small farmers or working-class folks who didn't have a stake in the system, and some even spoke out against it. On the flip side, not everyone in the North was an abolitionist. There were plenty of folks up there who were indifferent or even benefited indirectly from the slave economy. So the lines weren't as clear-cut as they might seem. The Civil War officially started on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That marked the beginning of a conflict that would last over 4 years until 1865. It was the bloodiest war in American history, with an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 people losing their lives, more than in any other conflict this nation has faced. That's about 2% of the population at the time, if you can believe it. The war wasn't just fought in the fields of Virginia or Georgia. It stretched across the entire country, from the eastern seaboard to the Mississippi River. Major battles like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run became synonymous with unimaginable loss and sacrifice. And it wasn't just soldiers who suffered. Civilians were caught in the crossfire too, with cities like Atlanta and Richmond bearing the scars of war. It's important to note that this war was about more than just battles and casualties. It was a war for the soul of the nation, a struggle to define what kind of country America was going to be. In the end, the Union was preserved, but the cost was staggering, and the wounds, both literal and figurative, would take generations to heal. Fast forward to August 20th, 1866, and President Andrew Johnson declares the Civil War officially over. The war itself was fought over states' rights, sure, but at its core, it was about slavery. The North, under Lincoln, sought to preserve the Union and, eventually, to end slavery. The South wanted to protect their way of life, which meant keeping slavery intact. The end of the war was supposed to mark the end of slavery, but as we know, that wasn't the end of the struggle for freedom and equality. So, as we reflect on these two events today, the beginning of slavery in 1619 and the end of the Civil War in 1866, it's clear that the fight for justice didn't end with the war. It's been a long road, and we're still walking it. But understanding how we got here is key to moving forward. Thanks for sticking with me on this journey. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button and join me next time for more stories from our past that shape our present. This is Cletus signing off. Stay curious, y'all, and keep digging into history. It's got a lot to teach us.